Welcome back to Political Spirits. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. And even if it gets a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. It is absolutely true that compromise is not a requirement. We just need to talk to each other. So what's the subject of today's discussion? Let's lighten it up a bit. As you know from reading the description of the podcast, I have a background in pursuing public policy efforts at the local, state, and federal level. Let me give you a few amusing anecdotes from my time doing that. I used to supervise teams of lobbyists around the country. I covered all 50 states and did work at the federal level too. Over my years of doing that, I always found it interesting that every state had its little quirks. Let me tell you about the time I had to fly to Baton Rouge to try to kill a piece of legislation that we had just found out about. I was in Denver when I got the call. I planned on heading home, but now I had to fly to Baton Rouge and meet up with a lobbyist we had just retained. I'd never met her. I was supposed to find her in the Capitol building based on the color of the dress she was wearing, and then we were going to lobby the Louisiana House of Representatives. Now, I had never lobbied in Louisiana previously. I expected that we'd be trying to catch legislators in the lobby outside the House chambers because we couldn't afford to wait to set up appointments in their offices. You see, the bill was already scheduled for a floor vote, and we had just found out about it. As a result, we were at serious risk of losing. We only had a couple of hours to turn it all around. Well, it's a good thing that in Louisiana there is, or there was back then, a way to lobby on the floor of the House. You were actually allowed to enter the House chambers when it was in session. You were escorted to a cordoned-off area in the back corner of the chambers. If I remember correctly, it was cordoned off with velvet theater ropes. Here's the really strange part. Inside those velvet theater ropes, it was packed with lobbyists and with the representatives who they had requested to come talk with them. The weird thing was that you couldn't talk with a representative until after they were inside the ropes. If you so much as said hi when they were approaching but hadn't entered the roped-off area, you were threatened with being thrown out. The sergeant-at-arms would pounce, and I half expected to get rapped on the knuckles with a ruler like I was a kid in a Catholic school being disciplined by a nun. But once inside the ropes, you could talk with them all you wanted, and you didn't even have to be quiet about it. This reminded me of the old TV show WKRP in Cincinnati. The show had a character named Les Nessman who wanted an office, but he was only given a desk, so he put tape on the floor where the office walls would be and even left an open section for the door. The other people on the show couldn't step over the tape that represented the walls. Instead, he'd make them walk around and go through the open tape door. Well, that's what it was like with the theater ropes. It was like they were pretending there were walls there, but they just had theater ropes. What possible difference could it make if you talked to somebody before they enter the ropes? Everybody could still hear it, but once you entered the roped area, they seemed to pretend that somehow magically it was as if the sound wouldn't pass beyond the rope stanchions, and you could talk as loud as you wanted. It made no sense, but apparently it did, in the state capital of Louisiana. By the way, the really interesting part of lobbying in that roped-off area was that if you didn't know who all the other lobbyists were on the other side of the issue you were dealing with, the people standing around you could actually be listening in so that they could rebut everything you said later and you wouldn't even know about it. So you sort of had to be looking around for people listening in while you were talking to the legislators. The legislators must have felt like they were talking to a paranoid person as my eyes were darting around to see if anyone was listening in as I was talking. You know what they say, you're not really paranoid if everybody is against you. In the end, we won that fight, so I guess I must not have looked too paranoid. You often hear in particular states that they don't like to be told what to do by outsiders. It's often described as being something specific to that state, but the reality is it's a very common sentiment. Having said that, it is really true in Hawaii. There, if you show up at a legislative hearing wearing a suit, you are presumed to be an outsider. The local dress is to wear a Hawaiian shirt and business pants. So when I was called to fly to Hawaii to testify at a legislative hearing, and to be in the state for only a few hours before turning around and flying back. The first thing that I did when I landed was go to a department store in a mall on the way to the Capitol building and buy a Hawaiian shirt. Not a bright Magnum PI type of Hawaiian shirt, but rather a muted brownish one that's typically worn there by locals. Not my style, I must admit. I never wore it again, but they must have liked what they heard from me. Perhaps they thought, that local guy makes a lot of sense. We won that one too. You know, I've always thought of Madison, Wisconsin as a really cold place, and that's been my experience. I felt like I darn near froze to death on one winter trip to the Capitol. So imagine my shock when I went there in the spring and they had a freakishly severe heat wave. The public buildings there mostly have the types of heating and air conditioning systems where they have to make a choice when to switch the system from heating to air conditioning. And it's a big deal, so you can't just switch it back to heating if a cold front comes through. Therefore, they wait until they're sure the warm weather has arrived before they make the switch. Well, this spring heat wave was extreme, but none of the buildings have been switched over to air conditioning yet. Now, I've pretty much fought a lifelong war against the law of gravity, so my portly self is not very fond of heat waves without air conditioning. But the lobbyist we hired was having a much bigger problem. He was not a young guy, and he was close to 300 pounds. I sat in a restaurant meeting with him planning our strategy, and the restaurant had not switched its system to air conditioning yet. I watched the lobbyist as he was taking napkins off the table, dipping them in the water glass, and then laying them one by one across his forehead. And since he hadn't had any better luck with his war against hair loss than he had with his war against the laws of gravity, his forehead started just above his eyebrows and ended just above his collar on the back of his head. So I sat there downing ice-cold Diet Cokes, and he sat there looking like he was building a turban out of wet paper napkins. After the hearing was over, he had to go to another client meeting, and I had time to kill before leaving for the airport. So I walked down to the area between the two lakes in Madison. It's a beautiful downtown. And I lay down on a picnic table, hoping to catch a breeze to cut the brutal heat. Unfortunately, there was apparently some sort of mayfly hatch or something else going on that produced more bugs than I've ever seen in my life. And those bugs had all landed on the back of my dress shirt before I unintentionally squished every one of them when I lay down on the table. When the breeze never came back, I finally called a cab and headed to the airport. When I arrived, I walked into the terminal drenched in sweat, with my back covered with more bug carcasses than the front of a motorhome that's just driven across the Everglades on a hot summer night. Two things were on my mind. One, I couldn't wait to get home, and two, I pitied whoever had to sit next to me on the plane. When I walked in the airport, I was being paged. I picked up the phone. "We have an emergency in San Jose, California. You have to fly there for an airport hearing." So I'm standing there in the only business clothes I had for the trip, and they were in such bad shape that a homeless person would probably turn them down. Thank God for hotels with overnight laundry service. I wonder if they had to steam clean the airline seat I sat in. Next topic. Equality of outcome. The fight over what is fair in society between the left and the right is largely a fight that results from the difference between pursuing equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. Not only does the left typically see an unequal outcome as a confirmation that the process through which the participants work to reach that outcome must have been unfair, but the left sees the job of government to be producing an equal outcome for everyone. How many videos are there on YouTube which talk about unequal distribution of income in America, which label the result as unfair because it's unequal? The right, and I'm clearly to the right on this one, sees an unequal outcome as a natural occurrence and instead focuses on equality of opportunity. Before we talk about equality of opportunity, let's engage in a little thought exercise to see if we understand what would happen in a particular situation and why. Imagine we take 1,000 teenagers and we give them each $250,000. We tell them that they can do with it whatever they wish, and we set up the exercise so that they can receive no other funding from anybody else. Then we come back when they're all 50 years old. What do you think the odds are that every one of them would have exactly the same amount of money? There's absolutely no chance that every one of them would have the same amount of money. The reason is because equality of outcome is not a natural result. They'll never end up with all having the same amount of money because we all have different strengths and weaknesses, and we all make different choices. Some will blow it on drugs or consumer goods or whatever. Some will choose a career that's their passion but not very well paying. Some will work their butts off. Some will have the perfect combination of talent, luck, and hard work. The only way to have an equal outcome is through the government taking the money from some and giving it to others. Doing that to produce equality of result should be viewed for what it is: legalized theft. The fair system is the one that allows people to keep the fruits of their labor, God-given talent, and desire to take entrepreneurial risks that drive the economy. It is the act of messing with that through tax policy and talk of it by politicians that drives money out of the economy, offshore, and onto the sidelines. That, at some point you have enough BS, is what produced the strung-out, half-assed recovery from 2008 to 2016. The right's view is that government should simply maintain the society such that people are free to invest and enjoy the fruits of their labor, and government should simply help ensure that the societal structures are there for the citizens to pursue employment and entrepreneurship, usually with either a minimum of regulation or at least significantly less regulation than pursued by the left. At this point, I'm firmly in the camp of the right. In the last 40 years, there have been 2 presidents who made a serious effort at reducing federal government regulation on a large scale: Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. Both experienced a significant improvement in the economy, and even some liberal publications acknowledged the effect. Part of what makes the improvement in the economy during the Trump administration so impressive is that it absolutely is contrary to the widespread predictions of political pundits and many economic pundits who contended that the economy would tank if Trump were elected president. I admit I'm impressed with the success that the Trump administration has had with the economy so far. But part of the reason why people are impressed, even if they won't admit it, is because of the extreme disparity between the predictions of the pundits and what has actually happened since his election. Frankly, I think the pundits should have seen the more positive results coming. Not because they were coming regardless, but rather because of how poorly the economy performed under the Obama administration. Much like the pundits who predicted that Hillary Clinton would win the election, that seemed to be feeding off each other's predictions rather than engaging in any independent analysis, the pundits discussing the performance of the Obama administration, when it comes to the economy, seem to accept mediocrity and even praise it. We should have come roaring out of the recession, but instead we sort of muddled along with a slow rise and then started to fall again at the end of his administration. We never came roaring out of the recession because the Obama administration was too dedicated to expanding regulation to satisfy its leftist base. When you propose and then pass a dramatic expansion of the power of the EPA to regulate the public waters of the country, fundamentally reinterpret the nature of the relationship between franchisors and franchisees so that franchisees are treated much like employees and the benefit of franchising is gutted, and when you basically announce that you're going to destroy through regulation an entire industry, the coal industry, rather than using every arrow in our economic quiver to compete in the world economy, what do you expect? Money gets left on the sidelines, entrepreneurial risks are not taken because of the conclusion that the financial return is too unlikely because of the exploding potential for regulation. What I'm saying is that Barack Obama's economic performance left so much investment on the sidelines that it was inevitable when Donald Trump started doing what he said he was going to do, that the economy, including investment of capital and expansion of employment, would surge. So if Barack Obama performed so poorly with regard to the economy, why was that never pointed out by the bulk of the political and economic pundits we watch every day? I believe it's for the same reasons that I've been talking about throughout every episode of this podcast. Movies receive more positive ratings if they talk about certain left-wing themes in a politically correct way. Presidential administrations are spoken of more positively by the media, including the television and internet-based punditry, if they tend to take left-of-center positions. See, for example, the study I discussed in the last episode, which revealed that in the first 60 days of the Obama administration, it was described positively by the media 8 times more often than the media described the Trump administration positively in its first 60 days. I believe the pundits, including well-educated economists who we view on cable television, are influenced by whether a particular administration shares their political views, which have nothing to do with economics. Moreover, given that those pundits are dependent in many instances on invitations for appearances in the mainstream media, and that they likely know that the bulk of the mainstream media likewise leans left, and are therefore more likely to support presidential administrations which are Democrat, those pundits may be asking themselves whether they can afford to be particularly critical of an administration such as the Obama administration, or particularly complimentary of an administration such as the Trump administration. In the end, I believe that we are being failed by many of the so-called experts on which we rely because they're influenced by politics. One benefit of my proposal that we should all be clear about where we stand on the issues and talk about it, perhaps over a few drinks, as I've said, is that it might promote a belief that the place for politics is in open discussion, not hidden from view and secretly influencing every aspect of our lives. One can hope. Next topic. I think I see that things are turning around. In every episode, we've talked about the problems that I see, the things that indicate that there's a real problem with the way things are going in our political system. We don't talk to each other. Each side characterizes the other as extreme. The left is generally much worse about the way they characterize the right because the left is more likely to refuse to talk and simply label the right's positions as outside the bounds of an acceptable society. For those of you who saw the real potential for positive developments with the election of Donald Trump, and include me among those, many of you must have been as disappointed as I was with how far the left took their characterization of the Trump administration. And I include the vast majority of the media in my reference to the left. There was at least some small part of me that thought there would be some soul-searching in the Democratic Party and in the media about why they didn't see what was coming in the election, and why, based on all appearances and the results, they seem to have lost touch with roughly half the country. I saw a little bit of talk along those lines, but it didn't last long. When the Democrat Party chose to go with labeling itself the resistance, any pretense of self-examination was abandoned, and unfortunately the media went right along with it. For example, Democrat politicians, party operatives, and pundits on the left routinely refer to President Trump as a racist. Generally speaking, they don't get pushback from the media insisting that they provide support for that contention. Frankly, that's ridiculous, and it's a discredit to the media. If there's one thing that should be apparent in this country, it is that being labeled a racist should be a horrendous thing. In a country that once allowed slavery and the systematic oppression of blacks, being labeled a racist should be the worst label of all. If the label was only attached to those deserving of it, that impact would persist. But unfortunately, the term has been politicized. It is thrown out without thought and analysis and accepted by many, based not on its truth as applied to an individual, but rather based in many instances on the assumption that if the individual is on the right, the label is deserved. In the case of Donald Trump, the purported support for the label is 1, he purportedly said that all Mexicans are rapists, and 2, he referred to third world countries, large numbers of which are populated primarily by blacks, as, quote, "whole countries," close quote. Let's take them one by one. We know that Donald Trump has been very critical of the way immigration has been handled in the U.S. He has criticized the enforcement of immigration law at the border, including releasing from custody those apprehended crossing the border illegally with an order to return for a court proceeding, and those orders are routinely ignored. The most commonly referenced instance of Trump purportedly saying that all Mexicans are rapists is from his announcement of his candidacy on June 16, 2015. Trump said that when Mexico sends its people, quote, "they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people," close quote. Is that a particularly eloquent statement? No, of course not. Trump can be a very persuasive speaker, but he's not exactly known as an eloquent one. Was he saying that all Mexicans are rapists? Absolutely not. Was he saying that all Mexicans who cross the border illegally are rapists? No. What he was saying is that when you allow massive amounts of immigration across the border illegally, the determining factor in who you will get will be those people who are in sufficiently dire straits that they'll risk the journey, and those people who are physically capable of making the journey. That's a recipe for getting lots of people with problems, whether those problems be that they have limited job skills, are desperately in need of social services such as welfare or food stamps, or are criminals in their home country and may even be subject to warrants for such conduct. What Trump was saying was that when you have an immigration system based on who can manage to sneak across the border, rather than picking the persons who can come, you're going to get people you never would have picked if you were given the chance. And that includes people who have engaged in criminal conduct, such as rape, for example. Perhaps that's the reason that PolitiFact begrudgingly rated Tim Kaine's statement that Donald Trump said, quote, "all Mexicans are rapists," close quote, as false. The second reason people give to support the claim that Donald Trump is a racist is his reference to, quote, "whole countries," close quote. The countries he was referencing included Haiti, El Salvador, and African countries. He was specifically discussing certain immigration protections for immigration from those countries. He questioned why we would have any particular protection for immigration from those locations, and in doing so, he referred to them as, quote, "whole countries," close quote. Is such speech eloquent? No. Is it presidential? Not by recent standards, at least. Is it sensitive? Not in the least. Is it racist? No, it isn't. In fact, you could argue that by fighting against high levels of immigration from such economically depressed countries, and instead proposing that we expand immigration from more developed countries, President Trump was being sensitive to those Americans at the lowest end of the economic spectrum who will be competing against those immigrants from the economically depressed countries for jobs here in the U.S. And because those Americans at the lowest ends of the economic spectrum in the U.S. are disproportionately black, the statement, although indelicately worded, is not racist, but rather may have been motivated by a genuine desire to help the black population of the U.S. So why have I labeled this segment, "I think I see that things are turning around"? The reason is because of what we've watched over the last 2 weeks with the Kavanaugh hearings. It's beginning to make me believe that we've reached a turning point. We may have reached a point where the masses in the U.S. electorate have seen that the left has simply gone too far and must be pushed back. The norm over the last few years has been for elected officials on the right to vociferously apologize if they're labeled by the left to be racist, misogynist, transphobic, Islamophobic, or, more recently, a rape apologist. Those who've been frustrated with elected officials on the right have said in the past that their strongest rebuttal has been to fall on the floor in a fetal position and ask to be kicked again. At first, I thought that might happen with the Kavanaugh confirmation when the allegations by Dr. Ford first surfaced. When more allegations surfaced, I thought it even more likely. But instead, something else happened. Republicans stuck to their guns and pushed back when Judge Kavanaugh spoke so forcefully and eloquently in response to Dr. Ford's presentation, which, by the way, was also very well done. In the end, the push by Senator Flake for the FBI to look into Dr. Ford's allegation ended up being very effective. As days passed, more and more evidence came out, which called into question what Ford had alleged, particularly with regard to whether the events happened in the early 80s, as she testified, or instead in the mid-80s, a time which would have placed Kavanaugh at college 300 miles away. For example, the memo from prosecutor Rachel Mitchell, who interviewed Dr. Ford when she testified, noted that she stated in a July 6 text to the Washington Post that it happened in the mid-1980s, but in her July 30 letter to Senator Feinstein, she said it happened in the early 1980s. Likewise, a Washington Post article reported that the notes from her therapist session in 2013 stated that she said it occurred in her late teens. However, she told both the Post and the Senate committee that she was 15 when it occurred. Being 15 would align with the early 80s, the time frame she gave the committee. Specifically, she told the committee it happened in 1982. Other information which came out included building permits from 2008 for the construction on her house, which included the second front door, even though she referenced 2012 for the construction. Moreover, records showed that the construction resulted in the addition of an office to the home, which was later used for a marriage counselor's office. That conflicts with her explanation that she wanted the second front door as a means of escape because of the anxiety caused by the sexual assault she endured some 36 years previously and 30 years prior to when she said the door was added. Not only did the additional week provide for time for the evidence referenced above to come out, and for the issuance of the FBI report itself to the committee, but also it gave the country the chance to watch how over the top the left was being in its opposition to Kavanaugh. Those were confrontations which at times looked like they could erupt into violence, in combination with the discussion of what it actually means when you say the accuser must be believed. How can that ever be the standard? If the accuser as to anything must be believed, then why even have investigations? Why even have trials? Why even have interviews of anybody other than the accuser? The proposition that the accuser is to automatically be considered a victim by virtue of having made the accusation, and that, quote, we must believe the victim, close quote, should be something that terrifies everyone. You can't have a society where the mere fact of an accusation being made dooms the accused to loss of the job, promotion, or other advancement, and effectively results in being ostracized from society. I think that additional week gave the country an opportunity to think about it, and it gave the country an opportunity to watch how much the angry left looked like it either hadn't thought about it or it had, and the vision it has for the country is a truly frightening one. I've generally felt that the midterm elections would result in the Republicans losing seats in the House, but not losing control, and the Republicans gaining seats in the Senate. If that were to occur, that would be a very positive result for the Republicans, given that the number of Republicans at all levels of government in the U.S. is at its highest since around 1930. When you already have that many seats, it's very hard to gain any more, and very tough to avoid losing seats. However, in the last couple of months, I've become more skeptical. The Democrats really do seem to have a higher level of motivation to vote, or at least they did. I came to acknowledge that they might in fact take back the House and hold the Republicans to no gain or a minimal gain in the Senate, with a slight chance to take the Senate as well. But the Kavanaugh hearing seemed to have changed that. Republicans are now just as energized as Democrats. Moreover, I have a suspicion that a fair number of more centrist, old-style Democrats were turned off by the conduct of Democrats on the Kavanaugh matter. They may choose to stay home, and some may even vote Republican. I think there's an increased likelihood that Republican gains in the Senate may be more than just 1 or 2 seats. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but the odds that it will have increased. I also think the odds that the Republicans hold the House have increased. I don't have the same level of confidence that I did that Donald Trump would be elected president, but my confidence that the Republicans will do well in the midterms is increasing. Hopefully, I've won your confidence, and you'll show me by listening to Political Spirits again next week. Until then, this is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.